Welcome to Talent Strategy 60. I am your friendly neighborhood talent strategy nerd, Dr. Jim, and we are in for a fantastic conversation today. And the topic is going to be equity for women, the road to achieving parity. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in this discussion. And I think based on how many people have attended or at least registered to attend, we're in for an exciting conversation. So before we get rolling, I want to lay out some ground rules. Obviously, these are designed to be interactive and responsive. So I will be monitoring the comments, and if anybody has reactions, questions, comments, concerns, or even practical issues that they're trying to navigate, make sure you drop those questions or comments into the chat. I will create the space so that we can all have a constructive conversation, because the intent of this show is for talent strategy leaders to be able to take away actionable insights to help move their initiatives forward. So looking forward to this conversation. And before we get into the meat of the discussion, I want to introduce our fantastic panelists. So first up, and I wanted everybody to get a chance to introduce themselves and get the audience acquainted with their backgrounds and key passions. So first up, I want to introduce Maribeth Achterberg. Maribeth, welcome to the show. You're a podcast veteran, so I'm looking forward to hearing your revamped bio and story and details that you're going to share with the audience. So welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jim, and I'm humbled by your confidence in me. But hello, everybody. I'm Maribeth Achterberg. I'm the VP of Solution Delivery for Molson Coors Beverage Company. It's headquartered in Chicago, and the operations group is in Milwaukee, which is where I am in the IT group. I've been working for now, this is in my third decade, so lots of experience as far as being a woman, and most of the time in most of my career being one of the only women in the room full of men, because I've focused mainly on technical careers. And so I have a real passion now that I'm on the, further on in my career journey. I don't want to say on the back end, because who knows how long this will go. But I've got a passion for bringing women into technical careers, and particularly in information technology, because that's definitely a field that is not diminishing. In fact, it's becoming more and more pervasive. So passion for that, which leads to this discussion, obviously. So very happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
So I'm raising my eyebrow at you, Maribeth, because you left out some key things that I'm going to call out and give you a chance to respond to. So one of the things that I really like about Maribeth's background, and for those who aren't aware of Molson Coors, they are actually phenomenally progressive in terms of advancing a lot of initiatives. And one of the initiatives that Maribeth has spearheaded is building some substantial strength when it comes to leadership bench strength, and especially women in tech and leadership bench strength. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Maribeth, and share a little bit about some of that work that you've done, and also how that's empowered by Gavin, the CEO, who has actually drilled that down across the entire enterprise on a number of different areas. So share with us a little bit about the story behind that.
Yeah, definitely. So Molson Coors has a very strong DEI program, believes very strongly in that. And of course, being a consumer products business, you definitely want to mirror the consumers of your products. And so there's a lot of attention and effort put towards that. The whole month of October, there's programming talking about DEI, different facets of that. So there is a strong commitment in this company to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I applaud them for that, because it really is a differentiator, I believe, in the strength of the company. One of the things that I did start, though, last year, or the year before last, was a focused effort on women in technology in Molson Coors, because I believe that not only to bring more women into the roles that we have today in our IT groups, but to help women outside of IT and business functions understand the value of having those capabilities, whether they join us in IT or whether they apply those capabilities in the role that they have. And I want them to see that there's a pathway for them. And for underserved populations outside of Molson Coors. a real focus through some programming like IC Stars and others to say that, it's not a 4-year degree that will put you here in an IT career. There are many different ways to get to an IT career. And then finally, I did forget to mention, and thank you for that I'm on the state board of Women in Technology Wisconsin. And so real focus there on bringing tech capabilities from elementary school through high school through universities, and then in the career that women have all the way to the senior level, and putting a focus now on more women in the boardroom. So that group is very progressive as well.
Awesome stuff. Thanks for sharing that, Maribeth. And oh, by the way, for anybody that's interested in listening out in the audience, Molson Coors is hiring. Maribeth's team is hiring. And actually, in particular, one of Maribeth's reports, Michelle Olson, who is also another fantastic leader in tech, her team is hiring as well. So if you're in tech, definitely consider applying to Molson Coors. And by the way, this is not sponsored by Molson Coors, so don't drop that in the chat either. So thanks, Maribeth. Appreciate your insights and looking forward to the great conversation. Next up, we have Dr. Peren I did it. I totally butchered the name. Could you pronounce your last name, Doc?
Yes, I was so excited that you were going to finish through, but it's okay. It's Dr. Peren Sabuncu, and thank you for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be on the panel with you and Maribeth as we talk about this really important, complex issue. I am the founder and the CEO of True Alliance Group. I started this company because my journey took me from the basic level of human needs, which is shelter, in architecture, all the way up to conflict resolution of the top forms of human needs, where that's psychological. And that's where diversity, equity, and inclusion fall under. It's important to understand that consulting or any type of business should be human centric, and that was my vision in creating a conflict resolution focused, human centric consulting company. And so, like I said, it's gone from creativity, but creativity to consulting. I've gone through first various companies where I advise people in government, in higher education, in corporations, all over the world. And at the end of the day, it comes from understanding who the person is that I'm speaking to and who they want to speak to. So it's all about the voices and understanding the human behind the messages and the missions. Other than that, I would say my work focuses on excelling human empowerment. And with that, it's important that we excel every type of human. As a woman, I am interested and just beyond myself in looking at different structures of what's important for different gender roles and how structures have been leaning more towards one versus the other, and how we can change that.
So I appreciate you sharing that, Doc. And before we get into the serious part of the conversation, I've always wanted to do this, so I'm going to say, "What's up, Doc?" and just kind of throw that out there. But there is something that I want to throw back and pose to you, and it's really interesting that your doctoral research is on the topic of conflict analysis and resolution, and I would imagine one of the issues that you come up against when you are consulting, especially in organizations in terms of organizational design, team structure, any of the things that you get into, is pushback from certain elements of that enterprise that say, well, why should we even focus on this sort of stuff? Everything's fine here. Nobody's really said anything about the current structure. Why is this an area of focus? And you probably encounter some resistance. And let's, just so I'm being clear, there are probably guys that just push back on the whole concept of why do we even need to worry about this? how do you respond to that in a way that reorients them or at least moves them on the path to allyship and advancing what's important versus shutting that off? And the reason why I ask that question is that oftentimes in our effort to solve these things, it's kind of easy to fall into these binary distinctions of you're either with us or against us. And my belief is that if you take that approach, it doesn't really advance the conversation. So how have you leveraged your experience, your research to get around that resistance that you might uncover? Because that's going to be critical information for other practitioners to be able to navigate as well.
That's a great question, and I've definitely had numerous challenges explaining the importance and necessity of conflict resolution. And I've narrowed it down to learning the language. So with consulting, especially with businesses, they're all revenue based, and you have to frame it in that type of message. And so in short, all I say is if you're interested in increasing your revenue and decreasing your liabilities, then you need to look at your people as assets. And the way, just like you build any other asset, you build your people up so that they can continue giving back and increasing your revenue.
That's fantastic stuff. And I think if I understand what you're describing correctly, the best path forward to help at least people reorient themselves is talk about the business implication of the current state. If we keep going down this path, this is what we're costing ourselves. And I won't. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I heard from what you said. And when we look at it from the perspective of talent strategy in general, that economic impact is really important, because what do we hear from everybody that's in a hiring capacity right now? We can't find enough people, or we can't keep our people. And there's an economic impact to both sides of that statement. And if we're not being intentional about these different elements of diversity within our organizations, we're going to continue having those problems, and people are going to be wondering, why is this organization underperforming? So I'm looking forward to how all of that gets tied together. So one of the things that I want to do as we dive into the conversation is really set the stage for those in the audience of what are we actually looking at. And I'm gonna go through and highlight some key comments that have been said previously and give everybody a chance to respond, and the audience is welcome to respond as well. But when we look at this issue of building equity for women in the workplace, here's the situation on the ground. You have less than 10% of the Fortune 500 companies that are led by women. So any idea or thought process that this is going to be a quick fix, it's clearly misguided. Then when you look at how you want to solve this problem or these problems, because of the way the world is now, the new normal or whatever you want to call it, it requires different thinking and bold thinking and innovation versus, hey, this is what used to work before, it's going to continue work going forward. So it requires people and leaders to step up in new and unique ways and assume some risk to say, hey, we can't continue on this path anymore. And that's a responsibility, at the highest levels of organizations that need to go down. There's also another element of how work is structured where it's not designed well. When you look at how work is structured in the world from a day-to-day perspective, it's predominantly male-oriented as far as what the focus is. It's not really very flexible when you factor in caregiving and some of the other responsibilities that typically fall on the shoulders of women. And when you look at work design, work process, flexibility, any number of policies that govern day-to-day interaction in the office, they're not really women-centric. And you have all of these scenarios that exist, and people are still asking the question, well, we don't understand why we can't attract women to our workforce. We don't understand why 3 million women left the workforce during the pandemic and aren't coming back. It seems like a really odd disconnect between yes, we recognize how the world is, but we still can't bridge the gap between how do we solve it. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to respond and add some context to what was said. How do you respond to that disconnect between understanding the problem, but I'm just going to say it. It seems like an unwillingness to be different in seeking out solutions to those problems. Doc, I'll hand it off to you and give you the first opportunity to respond.
My belief in diversity, equity, and inclusion is that bringing in another type of person that you're not used to should not be uh, a concept of you have to or you're being forced to. It should be I value another type of perspective, another type of human. And because I value that, because I have curiosity, then I want to include them. And then I realize that my business entity gets better because then I have multiple perspectives, multiple personalities, and multiple different types of human beings within the workforce, making this relatable to the reality of the population in the world. And in essence, when we look at how to deconstruct the current structures and renovate it per se, would be it's hard, because you have to worry about so many different things. And on top of that, you're saying, okay, well, now I have to figure out how to make this diverse, how to be inclusive to everybody. And all I know is people who are aligned with me, as in people who are similar to me. And that's just human nature. You're pulled in by what's easy to understand. And to understand those that are different, it takes time. It takes time for you to pause, to open up your mind, to gather information through observation, interaction, and then to turn back and say, okay, I value everything that you're giving me, and I'm going to make a place for it by restructuring the environment. If I go back to the whole revenue statement, that pause in business time can be detrimental to the bottom line if you're not doing it correctly. Even though it's a long-term investment, most people have the mindset of short-term investments.
I got to remember to get myself off mute. I really like a couple of things that you mentioned there, Dr. Peren, and that's this concept of value and also short-term versus long-term thinking. We're going to tie that together a little bit later on in the conversation. I want to give Maribeth a chance to respond to anything that you said or how we set the stage. And not to like lead the witness, but I think there's some interesting experiences from your entire career arc that offer some pretty good perspective. So I'd love for you to bring that into the conversation about the landscape and how it's changed, but also how there's so much more that needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you definitely hit some of those really high points. This is hard. This is not easy. This is not a toggle switch. No matter how much we ask for or demand or say this is the way we need to go, no matter how many studies are published that proves that we will improve our bottom line by having a more diverse and inclusive culture in our companies. Changing from what you know to something new is hard. People don't like to change. I mean, most people. I kind of like it a lot, but the thing is, we have to be able to prove and measure the change and prove that value statement in our hypothesis about what we say on the outset. And so for me, there's an awful lot of techniques from my background I learned in Six Sigma and Lean that we can employ. What is the voice of the customer? What's the voice of the process? Where is it that we can create that correlation and start to test our hypotheses? And so we don't have to upheaval the whole system right away. One of the techniques we can do is have some, I used to call it, well, it used to be called a tiger team. I think there's probably other names for it now, where you have a hypothesis, you ask people to come together and work differently than the way that the rest of the organization is working, give them a real problem to solve, because I think that's the other key thing, is giving people real problems to solve that are outside of their norm will help them be open to new ways of working and other people's perspectives. Give them a real problem to solve. And then when the time is over, like a whole quarter's worth of time where they have the problem that's solved and they implement that solution, you have them share the experience. What was that like working with different people from different functions and different backgrounds? How did their perspective change the way you think about work? And then the companies need to have the commitment to make those changes. We do this for other things. We do it for manufacturing processes. We do this even in IT, moving from waterfall to agile. We do these things. We don't do these things as often when it's impacting our culture and the landscape of who we employ. And I think we need to learn lessons from other functions in our organizations and apply them to this problem. Because the fact is we are in a situation where, we're not meeting the needs of women in the workplace. And that is going to become a real issue soon. And it may move us into different work. It may move us into different work. What's the word I'm looking for? Paradigms. This whole prediction that we'd be more gig workers than employees hasn't completely come true, but maybe this is one of the things that will accelerate that. I don't know, but I think we have to also. Have to think about those new ways of working and having some proofs of concept so we can start to move the needle.
Great insight there, and you got some pretty good reactions from the audience in terms of the emojis that they dropped. So that's hitting. Both of you are off to a great start. I want to follow up with something that you mentioned, Maribeth, and you mentioned this concept of a tiger team, but more importantly, assigning a task force a specific problem to solve to advance an initiative. And I think that's important. I think one of the challenges with that in any effort is justifying and getting your stakeholders to back that initiative and get funding. Because oftentimes what happens in these initiatives, or at least this is what I hear, is there will be a task force created for XYZ initiative with no funding. So you're just creating extra work for teams. So how have you navigated those challenges, both as somebody that's impacted it from the front line, but also from the strategic level? Share some insight, or tell us how you would get around those sort of challenges when that's being proposed.
Well, first of all, I don't say just make the tiger team to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion. That the tiger team is around a real business problem with a real payback and a real problem that they have to solve that has value to the organization. And that's really the only way we're going to move the needle here. But there's plenty of research to show, like, just in preparation for this, I was looking, and there was a McKinsey study that was published in 2016 that said that if every state and city in the US had full gender parity, it would add 4.3 trillion to the country's economy by 2025. That's amazing. That's an incentive. So when I say give them a problem to solve, it's not the DEI problem to solve. It's not the parity for women, although that's an underlying that's the underlying hypothesis that I want to prove. But the problem has to be a real business problem. And that's not new. That's been the same conversation I've had for the whole, 3 decades I've been working. It's like, this is a great idea, but what problem is it going to solve? And we really need to focus on it, right? Because at the end of the day, almost every organization, but every for-profit organization has to create value for their shareholders or stockholders or stakeholders.
I really like the reframe that you did there, and it took me into a different direction that I want to pose to Dr. Peren. And it's the underlying business problem, and you mentioned a data point that I wasn't aware of. That's a significant business impact that comes from the pay equity element of it. But when you look at the landscape and you just look at it from a gender perspective, the data around women being at this point more highly educated than men, getting more advanced degrees, being from a credentialing perspective across the board, they're outperforming men across multiple levels when it comes to educational achievement and attainment. And then you put that in where we're talking about tackling a real business problem, which is the talent, quote unquote, shortage. You have that line going one direction, but then the work arrangement staying the same way it's always been, being highly male centric. And then if the trends within educational attainment amongst men continue, you're going to have an opposite line where that attainment is decreasing, and you have hiring folks that are just not being creative in terms of, or at least solutions oriented in terms of fixing the problem. And what I want to pose to Dr. Peren is, when you look at that disconnect between the skills gap that's emerging between men and women and how the world of work has remained largely static, how do you connect those two together to impact change as a consultant in work design, in job function, in any number of other business criteria? What would be your approach to bridge that gap and create a pivot for organizations to move forward?
My answer to that would be to train. The first step would be to, well, I would say to go in and conduct a gap analysis. And with that being gaps in training, gaps in understanding, you can throw a problem to a company or even a group within the company, but they may not necessarily know how to problem solve. And it's important for them to have the conflict resolution skills within their toolbox, so that they can understand the problems, understand how to analyze, and then resolve. And also understand that conflict resolution is more conflict transformation, because there are problems where it's not taking away the problem completely. It's transforming it so that you're not back in the same place. And I just want to throw out another statistic that's really important. According to a global human capital report, conflict within the workplace costs $359 billion in paid hours. And so that's a statistic that it's a report from way back in 2008. And I can only imagine that how much it has increased. But what I also see in the discrepancy in the data is that there isn't as much studies going through to come up with new numbers, essentially because a lot of companies and their leadership don't want to focus on internal conflicts. They don't want others to see that internal conflict because it's bad for reputation. And so the way that I would connect back to your question is that it comes with information, it comes with transparency. You have to admit the problem before anybody can even try to resolve it, try to transform where you're coming from to where you're going.
I really like the direction of where the conversation is going, largely in part because of where you, Doc, and Maribeth have taken it from a business impact perspective. That data point that you mentioned is really interesting because there's another downstream impact that I think we can connect together. So when we look at conflict that exists, gender inequality within the workplace, I tend to always go through, I view the lens of the world through retention and turnover because that's really my nerd area. But when you move further up funnel from there, and you're talking about conflict, when you're talking about inflexibility within the workplace, when you're talking about work design and all of those things that we've started the conversation about, that has an impact on how engaged your employees are, how included they feel, and that all runs downstream to another economic impact, which is the cost of turnover. But before it gets to the cost of turnover, disengaged workforces, and this is another big number, disengaged workforces cost, and this was a recent study, disengaged workforces cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $550 billion a year to American businesses. So this is why I've had a thread of these sort of topics on engagement, retention, inclusion, belonging, because it's all related, and you can't really take them as big umbrella pieces. You have to break it down piece by piece to actually impact change. So I really like and appreciate what you've shared so far. So we have a good baseline for, hey, okay, this is the problem, these are the problems, these are the financial impacts, and this is a loaded question. Well, if we're talking about how to fix it or how to restructure it, where do you start? Because this is one of the biggest elephants you're going to eat. And Maribeth, you get the honor of tackling that question. So I just voluntarily told you that you're in charge.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different things that I think are really important to pay attention to when you're trying to attack this issue. It's a real business issue, as we've talked about. One of those things is making sure that women are entering leadership and management roles. And there's several reasons I think that's important. I think it's important because there's a whole facet of the business and business process and human interaction that you're exposed to as a manager and a leader of people that you don't ever see as an individual contributor. And so if we aren't getting women into those first line management roles, they're not coming up through the ranks and they're not understanding how organizations work and how managing and leading people impacts the bottom line of a company. And so there's many more topics that you're exposed to when you're finally in that leadership or management role. Secondly, I agree with you. The structure of how business, particularly in America, but other countries as well, let's focus on America, is that structure is very male-centric. It's very much thinking in boxes instead of connecting lines. and women tend to think more in connecting lines than in boxes. And so that's why I'm a huge proponent of business agility and agile ways of working, because it pushes decision-making down to the lowest level that can actually make it. And it's more transparent and inclusive. So if you're really serious about diversity, inclusion, and equity, DEI, then you really need to look at being more agile in the way you work, because it really does become more transparent in what's happening in the organization. It really does push decision-making down to the lowest level that can make it. It really does give everybody a voice as they're attacking, the problems and the work before them. And so it's one, getting more women in those management positions so they're exposed to how business actually operates. And second, focusing more on processes and the way of working that's more gender neutral and actually invites women's proclivities, at least the way I believe that they have proclivity to be more connected, collaborative, and coordinating across to create business value. And that's really why we're all going to work, is to create value for someone.
Wow, there's a lot there, and I don't have any disagreement with anything that you said. I'm going to pick up a thread of what you said and toss it to Dr. Peren. Absolutely agree that we need to bring more women into leaderships and at least line level managers, and then start the process of building them up. That's an absolute given. I think one of the gaps that exists within most organizations is that when you look at that progression across any level, your first time managers are usually very under-resourced in terms of training and development when it comes to getting them prepared to shift into a people management role. So that's one thing that Dr. Peren, I'd like your insight on, is how can organizations better prepare their leaders in general, but women leaders in particular, to be leading effectively. And I think that's a training and development question that I'm posing. So what would you offer organizations? I mean, obviously respond to the earlier question that I posed. Where do you start, and how do you start the process of restructuring? But to Maribeth's specific point about we need to get more women in leadership, how do we put women in leadership in a position to be successful through the lens of training and development, so that it's not, it's not one of these scenarios, oh, we promoted so and so, they didn't do a good job, so we're going to just like isolate every other woman from ever getting a shot. That's really what I'm thinking about whenever we talk about these sort of topics. So floor is yours, Doc.
Thank you, Doc. Well, the way as I'm thinking, my mind's just going in all kinds of directions. I'm definitely stimulated with information. Um, I want to go back and touch on what Maribeth said about Lean Six Sigma principles and how that started with manufacturing and production, and how those are really dominated industries. And in doing so, where that mindset has gone into, we have to be so specific in making sure that our production is 99% successful, that it has caused tunnel vision. And it has caused tunnel vision so much because there's a concentration on product, generating as much product with the least amount of mistakes. And so going back to the newer, where I'm sure you've heard it, the design thinking principle in business now, where they've taken that from designers, creatives, and said we can create new prototypes. And so that's also opening up your mind in saying, hey, the end result can be something different. And taking that comparison between design thinking and Lean Six Sigma, and saying to, for example, leadership and executives, saying, if you're not inclusive of people who are trying to create new things, they become your competition. And so it's either you build a stronger team with these people that are going to take it to the next level and bring in new creative ideas, new prototypes, um, anything that's transformational for the world. It's either you include them and become stronger and transform as a company and move forward, or you lose them and then they start their own businesses, because they're not just, women are not going to step back and say, this structure is not working for me, so let me stay at home. Women are going to go back and say, this structure is not working for me, I'm going to start my own company. And in fact, in the last 20 years, there's been an 114% increase in women starting their own businesses. I foresee that number greatly increasing. The reason being is you can only, and this goes for any type of human being, you can only devalue a human being for so long before they say, I'm not even going to try to fight and try to show you how much I mean or how valuable I am, until I go back and show you exactly how valuable I am by creating a real problem for you through competition.
So there's really something very interesting about what you just said. When people, and I'm paraphrasing, when people feel devalued, there's going to be a point where they just say, okay, well, I'm just going to do whatever is absolutely necessary to not get hassled, and then just move on with my day. That's a complete paraphrase of something that was much more profound that you said. But I'm going somewhere with this. We've both, well, all of us have heard about quiet quitting and all this sort of stuff that's happening, and it just triggered with what you had said, Dr. Peren. I want you to tie those two threads together. You have this track record for organizations basically taking a cog in the wheel approach to their teams and their people, and especially women. And then at the same time, you have organizations or higher levels of detached leadership who are saying, well, I don't understand why people aren't, maintaining the level of productivity that they had before. I don't get it. How are those two things related from a human behavior and psychology perspective, and what can be done to shift that into a different direction?
I would say it depends. If somebody comes to me and says, I don't understand something, the first question I ask is, are you frustrated or are you open to learning? Because if you're frustrated, it means from a conflict resolution perspective, I have to put in the work to bring down your energy level from frustrated to open to learning. And that's a whole step within itself. So you can't fight logic with emotion. It's just not possible. Got to bring down the emotion first and then go in with the information. And so for leadership that's open to learning, then you go in and say, okay, it's almost like learning anything else. If you haven't gone to school in 20 years and all of a sudden, you use calculators instead of doing it in your head, then it's the same kind of thing. The world is changing, it's evolving. And so let's look at the new type of information. Let's look at what women are doing now, and what women are offering. And so with this amalgamation of information that's given, then leadership can say, okay, I've kind of been stuck in my own way of doing something. And now that I'm open to more information, I see how this ties into success. From my personal work, I have realized that it takes a lot more than conversation. You have to get into the numbers. You have to quantify the information for business leaders because that's what they're used to looking at.
This is phenomenal stuff, and I want to take a quick detour and point out that there is some great discussion going on in the chat on the live stream. So I want to thank both of you for driving some phenomenal conversation so far. And we're just, well, not getting started, but we're going to keep the ball rolling. So everybody that is commenting on the stream, thanks for your comments. If you have questions, make sure you drop those in. But great stuff so far. So I want to bridge this back to, hey, how do we create or deal with the issue of equity? And Maribeth, you hit at this with your comment about, hey, we need to start with getting more women on the leadership path and into leadership. That's a first step. We took that into a training and development and preparedness component. What else can be done to move the issue of equity forward? And I want to call something out really quickly that's an interesting point. And we have one of the folks that is chiming in on the chat, Carrie Simpson. She and I go way back. She was actually recently featured on the podcast. But one of the data points that she pointed out is that when you're looking at the sales function, women leaders tend to have teams that outperform male leaders somewhere in the neighborhood of, I always get this quote wrong, and Carrie was sure to correct me because she's been doing that to me since high school. But she said, typically she had mentioned that women-led sales teams outperform male-led sales teams somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8%. So I want to bring that together. Dr. Peren, you mentioned that we have to take the emotion out of the conversation and deal with data. And yet you have this dynamic, at least in the sales function, where there's clear overperformance by women, and yet you only see very small numbers of of women getting into leadership. So I want Maribeth to kind of talk through, beyond just advancing women into leadership, what are the things that need to be done to move the ball even further from an equity perspective?
Well, I think one of the most important things that has to be done, and regardless of all the things that we do from a business perspective, is ensure that we have more women representation in the C-suite and in the boardroom, because that's where the decisions are made. That's where these initiatives are driven from. And we're grossly underrepresented right now in both of those spaces. And so that is a game changer. I think when the ability to receive not funding, but investment in some of I think it was Goldman Sachs said, I have to see equity in the boardroom before we're going to fund your organization. That was huge, and it started to move the needle. We need more of that. That's a macro level, and if we're going to change if we're going to change this in any amount of time, in the next five to 10 years, those actions have to be happening at the macro level. But at a more micro level, I think it's really having managers at all levels of the organization require that we have data-driven decision making. And so you may like something or not like something, but every decision you make should be backed up with data. And that's the other thing that I think we can do at a more micro level. Make sure that decisions, if we're going to take a decision, there has to be information and data to back up that decision and make sure that's the right thing for us to do. Because I think the reason why we're not seeing more movement in this space, women feeling more satisfaction in their jobs, not having the ability to move up, is we're not required to prove that the thing that we say we need to do has data behind it. And so for me, that's one of the things that can happen right away. You can say, look, okay, that's fine. I want to understand the data. Why do you think this is the best thing to do? Instead of just saying, well, this is what we're going to do. And with no reason behind it. That should not be tolerated any longer at any level of the organization.
Great insights. Dr. Peren, I want to hand that same question off to you. When we're looking at advancing the cause of equity in the workplace, we've mapped out a number of different areas. What are some of the things that you see as necessary next steps for organizations when it comes to creating gender equity within the workplace, independent of whether we're just talking about pay, we're just talking about representation, which Maribeth brought up. What are some of the other steps that organizations should be taking?
What I want to start off with is just correct an interpretation of what I said of not taking out emotion and focusing on the data, but making emotion part of the data. So quantifying the emotion, because you can't take emotion out of it. And the reason for conflict resolution in that sense is that you have to address the emotion first before you get into any type of logic / data. And so the way that I would go about is, I agree with Maribeth in both the macro and the micro levels of, when you have a sponsor basically at board level that goes in and says, you're not getting this investment unless I see this, it matters. And that's what key sponsorship looks like. But when you don't have that, it's very difficult. So it's identifying those key sponsors in different networks and saying, all right, are you going to advocate, and how far are you willing to go with your advocacy? It's finding the investors, because in the business world, money talks. It's all about cash. And so when we look at where that cash is going, and how it's being given back to the world, that addresses the investment, but it also addresses the demand and supply. If women all of a sudden wanted to give a message to the world, or even just the US, and say, we're going to stop buying this particular product as women, that carries a huge importance. And that's the kind of message that you say, all right, by excluding this group of people from whatever it is that we're doing, we realize that what we've done is we've made a huge mistake. And so unfortunately, it goes back into this almost war, because people don't really listen to soft messages. You have to be a little aggressive and even more assertive with how you're carrying that message. If I go back to the micro level of using the data and then saying, okay, well, you have the data now. How do we move forward to transforming current leadership to what we want it to look like? And sometimes it's experimental. Sometimes you say, all right, let's take a woman on your team and trade places with her for a day. Let's see how that feels, because experience it's the biggest indicator of change. It's not just from hearing or reading. You have to be able to experience it to understand.
I think this should have been a 2-hour show, but I know that but I think both of you have lives. I'm the only one that sits around and runs his mouth all day. So, it is what it is. So great insights. I appreciate what both of you have shared. And I want to tie this back to one of the concepts in the beginning of the show. And I think I have to credit Dr. Peren for bringing this out in terms of work structure. And how the structure of work, the world of work, how it's basically in opposition to the needs, expectations, and realities of what women face from a day-to-day perspective. So when we're tackling the issue of, okay, if we're talking about restructuring how work is done, how it needs to be reshaped, what are some action items that leaders within organizations need to be thinking about? And I'm going to have you provide the first solution for that before we go to Maribeth. So Doc, the floor is yours. When we're looking at how work needs to be reshaped, what's your suggestion in terms of solving for that specific issue and having it be much more of a women-centric, well, I mean, worst case scenario, if we can make it a neutral, that's progress too. So you can take it either way that you want to go. But what are your suggestions to organizational leaders that want to reshape the world of work to make it more equitable?
That's a loaded question because there's no one answer for that. And it depends on the type of company that you're in and what your mission and vision is, and to best align that. So, what I would suggest is to go in with training and development and to open up the information transparency and learning. Couple it with data driven research and methodologies, not to discount that, because it's not just about action, it's about learning where that action's foundations lie. And a lot of the business world, there's this kind of rivalry between business and academics. And I find that very disappointing because academia lends the research that transforms how businesses and how humans evolve. And so that would be my suggestion, to go back and say we need every single person on the team to pick a case study and to study it and to learn about it, and then to offer the next type of case study to really push people to understand how their actions are benefiting the mission and the vision of the company, and give them almost like a prompt question. What would it look like if we had more women in the workplace? And to go from their answers.
So, Doc, I really appreciate your well-reasoned response to that question. But, from my perspective, we got to give the people what they want. We want a hot take. Throw out a hot take. Come on. No, I'm just kidding. It's a great point.
Throw them all out and replace them with women.
Well, yeah, I can get down with that. All right. Maribeth, same question to you. Same question to you.
Yeah, I think I alluded to one of them, changing the way we work, kind of blowing up this hierarchy and introducing a more agile way of approaching work, to me, is one of the things that really starts to level the playing field quite a bit. I think training is a big piece of it. Dr. Peren, we've done some innovative things at Molson Coors, the equity experience, where people are walking through rooms that are specific to an ethnicity or gender or a particular bias, and helping people understand the perspective and requiring that everybody in the company go through that. I think that sort of activity is huge and important. Making sure that we really reward the behaviors of sponsorship from men, because people will reinforce, that reinforces the behaviors. So, for example, we have certain values in our organization that a lot of our culture is organized around. One of them needs to be sponsorship. And you need to reward people based on the fact that they're sponsoring or being an ally. and having that behavior codified somehow, because people will begin to do it when when you're rewarding them for it, and then just frankly putting it into the structure of the organization, as I mentioned before. One of the things I didn't say, and I want to say now, is the uh, the the experience that is required, the credentials to be on a board, to be an independent board member, need to be examined, because we have this need to have a C-level title after everybody we have on our board. I think we need to re-examine that. I really do, because I think it's keeping a lot of women out of boardrooms, and it's keeping a lot of companies from having that experience as advisors to their organizations, from women who are not going to get into the room if that's actually a requirement. I have a lot of them. I mean, I think those are some of the key takeaways, but I think it's important that we examine those requirements, because we're not going to move the needle very fast if we continue to require C-level people in our boards, or as independent board members. And it only takes one person to say something. I remember watching Warren Buffett in an interview, and he was saying, "I think we should have more independent board members," and voila, there are now more independent board positions open. We need one person like a Warren Buffett to say, "You need to allow women with the experience but not the title onto your board," and voila, we will have them. So that sponsorship at the highest level is extremely important.
What you just said, Maribeth, especially when you're talking about the experience versus the title. That has broad application across any number of talent strategy initiatives that an organization takes. And I actually talk about it at a fairly tactical level, where, what are we concerned about when we hire anybody? Are we concerned about the optics or the outcomes? And when you're applying it to board level representation, do we want like the credentials without the outcomes, or do we want people that actually have actually driven results? Because that should be the focus, like who has impacted change independent of what their title is. And that's what we prioritize versus what makes us look good from a credentialing perspective. I really like that angle.
And I had one other point. I just remembered it was, and then I'll.
Okay, stop showing off.
I think we need to stop thinking about roles in organizations and more about skill sets.
Yep.
And not be so concerned about filling roles, but having a stable of people with skill sets or things that we want them to build, and apply them in that way. And if you're working in an agile way, it's a lot easier to get there than if you're really concerned about the hierarchy.
No, I really am a big fan of what you just said, Maribeth, because it's related to conversations that I've had over and over again with people in the position of hiring, where they're looking for this arbitrary profile. And I'm like, well, why is that important? Isn't it more important that the person that you're interviewing has delivered in the past the same thing that you're trying to deliver right now? And that's really where the focus should be. So great stuff. So before we wrap up,
I add something very quickly?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Before I forget, two things. One, I also wanted to say, I guess an intervention method or possible solution would also be to take this into public policy and to go that route, because sometimes you don't have that sponsorship within the business entity or even the network. But if it goes the route of public policy and then we change it where it's a requirement by the law, then, it's required. And then the other thing that I wanted to say was with talent strategy. I've always wondered what it would look like if resumes didn't have the names, where you couldn't tell, gender neutral, all other demographic identifiers are not there. And even to go as far as to say you can't even identify where you've worked, like the name of the places you've worked, the name of the universities that you've attended. And just like what Maribeth was saying about skill sets, just highlight what you've done and how that has been successful for you.
That's you saw me react to your comment about de-biasing the entire hiring process, and it's actually some of the work that we do at Circa, and there's other companies that do similar work where you're actually hiring for the attributes and skills, and then when you source that talent, it anonymizes that entire list of candidates that get in front of you. So you're actually evaluating based off of how do they line up against your scorecard. Now it relies on the scorecard being neutral, or at least having foundationally being structured the right way. But that's a fantastic call out, and it's one of the things that we talk about on a regular basis. How are you removing bias from the hiring process and making sure that from an objective criteria perspective, as many candidates as possible are getting an opportunity to get access to the role. So great stuff. So we're before we wind down, I want each of you to share one key takeaway that talent strategy professionals can use to advance the issue of gender equity in the workplace, and share where people can find you in terms of networking. So Doc, I'll hand off to you first. Dr. Peren, appreciate your insights. One key takeaway, and where can people find you?
Oh man, choosing one out of all of this is really hard. I guess the key takeaway being is there's hope. We're still a work in progress, and essentially bringing down the barriers to be more understanding and more curious of those that we don't that are not similar to us would be the first one. And then the way to go about it is really go into it. Trade places, find a woman leader and trade places with her for a day, and see how it is, see what it looks like, because that's the best way that I can say your experience will stick.
Maribeth, same question. Oh, wait a minute. Dr. Peren, where do people find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn through here. I think I can drop in the link right after when Maribeth goes, and then I can drop in my email address. Again, if you go to truealliancegroup.com, you can send me a direct message through my website as well.
Awesome, and thank you for sharing. Maribeth, floor is yours.
Oh, thank you.
Key takeaway, and where can people find you?
Yeah, key takeaway is it's time. It's 2022. Women, find your voice, speak up. Don't be afraid. Don't think about what you're going to lose. Think about what you're going to gain, and start standing up for what you know is right. That's the key takeaway, very strongly. We really do have to be bold and decisive and lead in this space. It's time. I've been at this for 30 years. Longer if you include growing up with three brothers. The time is now. We should stop talking and start doing. Where you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on the Women in Technology Wisconsin website, and at Molson Coors.
Awesome stuff. So I want to thank both of you for the great conversation, and obviously this should be like a multiple series that we do. But a lot of great insights. For those of you that are in the audience, make sure you drop a comment and make sure you connect with the panelists. It was a great discussion. For everybody tuning in, I want to thank everybody for joining and really having an engaging conversation in the chat and comments. So that was some really good stuff. If you are looking at solving any sort of talent strategy, or at least dealing with any sort of talent strategy challenges, feel free to reach out to either of the panelists. You can reach out to myself. We do a lot of work at Circa in helping organizations become more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive as organizations. Happy to have those conversations. So make sure you reach out to any of us if you have comments, questions, feedback. All of that will be welcomed, and looking forward to continuing the conversation over the next several weeks with another great series of panelists. So thank you both for joining, and tune in next time for another great episode of Talent Strategy 60.